HOA contractors drove steel survey stakes into the shoreline of my lake ranch, while Diane Whitmore stood beside them, calling it reclaimed community land. A red notice slapped against my fence in the wind. Behind it, 2 pickup trucks rolled past my cattle gate toward the boat ramp I owned, and a drone buzzed over the pasture like the whole place had already been taken. My barn, my dock, my south meadow, and the private access road feeding half that subdivision were all inside the same chain of title. If Diane pushed her claim too far, every homeowner behind her gate would be pulled into the same records fight. Then one contractor painted a white line across my gravel road. That was her first real mistake. The second was doing it in front of cameras. Lake mist hung low over the grass that morning. It smelled like wet cedar, diesel, and fresh paint. The hammering echoed across the water. Clang, clang, clang. Each stake landed closer to my dock. Diane wore a cream blazer and sunglasses, holding her clipboard like it gave her power over the soil beneath her heels. This area falls within HOA recreation expansion, she told a small group of residents. The ranch owner has been notified. I stood 10 yards away with mud on my boots and a coffee cup cooling in my hand. Nobody had notified me of anything that mattered. A man from the HOA legal committee unrolled a map across the hood of a truck. The paper snapped in the breeze. Several residents leaned in. One of them pointed toward my pasture and smiled like he was looking at future picnic space. Another lifted his phone and started recording. I watched Diane step closer to the fence. "Ethan Brooks," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You are obstructing lawful community development." The word lawful drifted over the grass and landed badly. "My name is Ethan Brooks. I am 46 years old, and that lake ranch has been in my family longer than the HOA has existed. My father repaired the old spillway by hand. My mother planted the cottonwoods near the dock. I rebuilt the east barn after a winter storm took half the roof. Every acre had a memory. Every road had a record." Diane knew the view. She did not know the paperwork under it. I walked toward the painted line across the gravel. The white paint was still wet. A sharp chemical smell rose from the stones. That road curved past my gate, ran between the pasture and the old pump house, then continued toward the HOA entrance beyond the tree line. Residents used it every day. Delivery trucks used it. Emergency vehicles used it. Diane had just marked it as part of her expansion zone. I looked at the map on the truck hood. A thick blue boundary wrapped around my shoreline. A yellow block covered my barn road. Then I saw a narrow gray strip labeled HOA Access Corridor. My thumb pressed harder against the coffee cup. The lid bent inward. That label did not belong there. Diane must have seen my face change, because she stepped between me and the map. "The board has already voted," she said. "We are moving forward." Behind her, the drone dipped lower over the lake. Its propellers chopped the morning air. The residents kept watching. The contractors kept painting, and the map kept lying in plain sight. Then I noticed the old survey marker beside the cattle gate. The survey marker sat half buried beside the cattle gate, its brass cap dull beneath years of dirt and grass. I crouched beside it while the contractors kept working behind me. The hammering continued. The drone buzzed overhead. Nobody paid attention to the marker. That alone caught my attention. A thin layer of soil brushed away beneath my glove. The stamped numbers slowly appeared. I read them once. Then again. Those numbers did not match the map Diane had displayed. A small detail. A very expensive detail. I stood and looked back toward the truck. The map still fluttered against the hood. Residents gathered closer around it. Diane was explaining future walking trails now. She sounded confident. Too confident. The smell of fresh paint drifted across the gravel road. Another contractor planted a flag near my pump house. A bright orange square snapped in the wind. Then another appeared near the dock. They were moving fast. That told me something. People move quickly when they believe nobody can stop them. I pulled out my phone and photographed the survey marker from 3 different angles. Then I photographed every painted line I could see. A few residents noticed. One older man lowered his sunglasses and watched me carefully. He did not say anything. His expression lingered in my mind. Diane eventually approached me again. "The board expects cooperation," she said. Her voice remained calm, but there was pressure behind it. "The board should verify its maps first," I replied. For a second, something changed in her face. Not fear, not concern, more like irritation. Then she smiled for the residents nearby. Everything has already been reviewed. She walked away before I could answer. That bothered me more than the conversation itself. Most people defending accurate information stay and discuss it. Diane seemed interested only in delivering conclusions. By noon, the shoreline looked different. Flags dotted the grass. Stakes marked future pathways. Several residents were already talking about community events they imagined happening there. Children pointed toward the lake. Parents nodded approvingly. None of them understood what they were actually standing on. The scale of the situation was growing. This was no longer just about my ranch. Hundreds of homeowners could eventually be affected if the records were wrong. That realization settled heavily over the afternoon. After the contractors left, silence returned to the shoreline. The lake water lapped softly against the dock. Wind moved through the cottonwoods. The painted lines remained. Bright, fresh, unwelcome. I walked to the old storage building behind the barn. The door creaked as I opened it. Dust floated through shafts of sunlight coming through gaps in the wood siding. Shelves lined the walls. Old tools, fishing equipment, boxes stacked decades ago. Near the back sat a steel filing cabinet that had not been opened in years. I pulled the bottom drawer open. The metal groaned. Folders filled with surveys, maintenance records, and property documents sat inside. Most were ordinary. Then I found a weathered tube tucked behind the cabinet itself. My pulse slowed. Not faster, slower. The tube was covered in dust. I carried it outside and set it across a picnic table facing the lake. Evening sunlight stretched across the water in long bands of gold. A pair of geese crossed the shoreline. Everything looked peaceful. The ranch always looked peaceful right before trouble arrived. I removed the cap and carefully slid out a rolled survey map. The paper crackled as it unfolded. Some of the ink had faded. Some had not. One boundary line immediately caught my eye. It ran straight through an area Diane claimed belonged to the HOA. Then I saw a label I had never noticed before. That name appeared nowhere on Diane's map. The label read Shoreline Development, Tract A. I stared at it while the evening breeze lifted the edge of the old survey map. The name meant nothing to most people. To me, it meant the map came from a period before the subdivision existed. That alone made it valuable. I spread the paper flat across the picnic table and studied every line. The fading ink traced roads, fence lines, utility easements, and shoreline boundaries. One road caught my attention immediately. It curved through the exact area now occupied by the HOA entrance. Another line connected the road directly to the ranch. I followed it with my finger. The connection was clear. The modern map and the old map were telling two different stories. A distant boat crossed the lake. Its wake rolled gently toward the shore. The sound snapped me back to the present. I pulled out my phone and photographed every section of the survey. Then I called the only person I knew who might recognize it. Frank Dawson answered on the third ring. He had spent decades working around local land records before retiring. "You still awake?" I asked. He laughed. "Depends what you found." 30 minutes later, his truck rolled into my driveway. Headlights swept across the barn and pasture. Frank climbed out carrying a flashlight and a battered thermos. He looked at the map for less than 10 seconds before his eyebrows rose. That reaction told me more than any words could. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Storage building." Frank slowly nodded. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. "This survey predates the subdivision." "That is what I thought." "No," he said quietly. "It is more important than that." He pointed toward the road line crossing the page. "Look here." The flashlight beam illuminated a section I had overlooked. Tiny handwritten notes ran along the edge of the road. Some had faded almost completely. Frank traced them carefully. This road was never shown as independent access. I felt a chill despite the warm evening air. "What does that mean?" Frank did not answer immediately. He kept studying the map. The silence stretched. Crickets chirped from the grass. Water moved softly against the dock pilings. Finally, he looked up. "It means somebody changed how this property was being described later." Those words settled heavily between us. Somebody changed it. Not nature. Not time. Somebody. We spent another hour comparing the survey with photographs I had taken earlier that day. The differences multiplied. Boundary lines shifted. Labels disappeared. Access markings changed. Each discovery raised new questions. Around 10 o'clock, Frank folded the survey carefully and slid it back into the tube. "You need records from the county archive," he said. "Not online copies. Original archive records." "Why?" He looked toward the dark outline of the subdivision beyond the trees. Because if this map is accurate, the problem is bigger than your shoreline. The night suddenly felt quieter. Even the wind seemed to fade. I followed his gaze toward the lights glowing beyond the ridge. Hundreds of homes sat there. Streets, utilities, parks, clubhouses, an entire community. Frank climbed into his truck, but paused before closing the door. Do not show this survey to Diane yet. I was not planning to. Good, he said. She may already know part of it. Then he drove away. Red taillights disappeared down the gravel road. I remained standing beside the picnic table long after the engine noise faded. The old survey tube rested under my hand. Across the lake, lights reflected on the water like scattered sparks. The subdivision looked peaceful from a distance. But one question refused to leave my mind. Why had that road been changed at all? I left before sunrise the next morning. A thin layer of fog drifted across the lake. The road was empty except for a delivery truck heading toward the subdivision. My tires crunched over gravel as I drove toward the county records building. Frank's warning stayed with me the entire trip. The road, the access description, the changed records. Something connected them. I could feel it. The county archive occupied the lower floor of an older brick building near the courthouse. The smell of paper and dust greeted me the moment I stepped inside. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Rows of filing cabinets stretched across the room. Most people never visited this place. Most people never needed to. A clerk directed me toward archived property records. I submitted the track number from the old survey and waited. Minutes later, several storage boxes arrived on a rolling cart. They looked untouched for years. The cardboard edges had faded. Handwritten labels covered the sides. I opened the first box carefully. Deeds, easements, survey amendments, transfer records. Hundreds of pages. Some were decades old. Some looked newer. I started building a timeline. One document led to another, then another. Hours passed. The room grew quieter as people came and went. Outside the windows, sunlight climbed higher across the parking lot. Inside, I kept turning pages. Around midday, I found the first major inconsistency. A transfer description referenced an access corridor. The wording matched the old survey almost exactly. I sat up straighter. The modern records used different language. Not slightly different. Completely different. I copied the reference number and continued searching. 3 files later, I found another match. Then another. My pulse slowed again. That always happened when pieces started fitting together. Excitement made people rush. Clarity made me slow down. The chain was becoming visible. A woman at a nearby table glanced over as I spread documents across the workspace. She probably wondered why someone cared so much about an old road. The answer was simple. That road connected everything. Shortly after 2 o'clock, a familiar voice interrupted my concentration. I thought I might find you here. I looked up. Frank stood beside the table holding 2 coffees. He set one beside me. Find anything? He asked. I slid several copies toward him. He studied them silently. The corners of his mouth tightened. That is not good. For who? I asked. Frank tapped a paragraph near the bottom of one page. Depends who has been relying on the newer descriptions. We reviewed records together for nearly an hour. More inconsistencies appeared. The original access language repeatedly pointed back toward land connected to the ranch. Every older document seemed to reinforce the same pattern. The newer descriptions gradually moved away from it. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Year after year. Someone had not rewritten history. They had slowly redirected attention away from it. That distinction mattered. A sudden burst of laughter echoed from the hallway. The normal sound felt strangely out of place. Frank leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. You know what worries me most? He asked. What? Nobody in the HOA seems interested in checking any of this. He was right. Diane had shown certainty. The board had shown certainty. Yet certainty without verification was dangerous, especially when property records were involved. Before leaving, I requested one final archive box connected to the earliest development phase of the subdivision. The clerk disappeared into a restricted storage area. Several minutes later, she returned carrying a thin file, much thinner than the others, almost empty. That alone caught my attention. I opened it carefully. Inside sat a single survey amendment and a folded letter. The amendment referenced the same corridor again, but the letter was addressed to a developer I had never heard of. I unfolded it slowly. The signature at the bottom made Frank lean forward immediately. The signature belonged to Harold Bennett. Frank exhaled slowly the moment he saw it. He did not need to explain why. I recognized the name immediately from local history. Bennett had been one of the original developers involved in transforming the lakeside area decades earlier. Most residents barely remembered him, yet his name still appeared in old newspaper articles and planning documents. The letter looked ordinary at first glance. Plain paper, typed, paragraphs, standard business language. Then I started reading. The room around me seemed to fade. The letter discussed access dependencies connected to the development project, not recommendations. Dependencies. The distinction mattered. One word described convenience. The other described necessity. I read the paragraph again, then a third time. Frank remained silent beside me. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere deeper in the archive room, a cart rolled across the floor. The sounds felt distant. You see it? Frank finally asked. I nodded. The letter referenced infrastructure assumptions tied to land outside the development boundary. My land, or at least the same ownership chain connected to my ranch. Suddenly, the old survey made more sense. So did the corridor descriptions. So did the disappearing labels. A puzzle that had felt scattered was beginning to organize itself. We requested copies immediately. The clerk returned with scanned reproductions and certification forms. By the time we left the building, the afternoon sun sat low over the courthouse square. Long shadows stretched across the sidewalks. The air smelled faintly of hot pavement and cut grass. Neither of us spoke much during the drive back. There was too much to process. Back at the ranch, I spread every document across the dining room table. The surface disappeared beneath maps, deeds, transfer records, surveys, and notes. Sunlight filtered through the western windows. Dust floated through the golden beams. I moved from page to page, connecting dates and references. One document pointed toward another. One amendment explained a previous discrepancy. Patterns emerged. Then a larger pattern emerged behind those. Around sunset, I noticed something that made me stop completely. Every major infrastructure reference kept circling back to the same original tract. Not occasionally, consistently. Roads, utility corridors, shoreline access, development staging. Everything seemed connected. I grabbed a yellow notepad and started drawing a timeline. The line stretched across several pages. Boxes connected to other boxes. Arrows linked transfers. Ownership chains branched outward. The structure became easier to visualize and far more concerning. A truck engine echoed outside. I looked through the window. A black SUV rolled slowly past the ranch entrance. It did not stop. It continued toward the subdivision. Maybe coincidence. Maybe not. Still, I watched until it disappeared beyond the trees. Then I returned to the documents. An hour later, my phone vibrated. The caller was a resident named Melissa Turner. I recognized her from the crowd gathered around Diane's map. I hope I am not bothering you, she said. Not at all. She hesitated. The HOA board just announced another community meeting. My attention sharpened immediately. When? 3 days from now. That was fast. Too fast. Melissa lowered her voice. They are talking about approving preliminary expansion work. I looked down at the documents covering the table. The timing felt significant. Diane was accelerating. The question was why. Did she know something was coming? Or did she simply believe nobody would challenge her version of events? After the call ended, I stepped outside. The sky had turned deep orange above the lake. Water reflected the fading light. Crickets filled the evening air. Across the shoreline, lights from the subdivision began appearing one by one. Hundreds of homes. Hundreds of families. Most had no idea their community sat in the middle of a growing ownership dispute. They thought this was about a shoreline expansion. The documents on my table suggested something much larger. Then I noticed a reference number repeated on 3 different records. The reference number appeared in 3 separate decades of records. That was not normal. I carried the documents back inside and spread them beneath the dining room lamp. The yellow light sharpened every handwritten note and faded stamp. Outside, the lake had gone dark. Only scattered reflections from distant shoreline homes remained. I compared each document side by side. The same number connected a survey amendment from the early development phase, an access corridor description years later, and a utility easement revision filed long afterward. 3 different purposes. 1 identical reference. That was not an accident. I opened my notebook and drew another timeline. The line stretched across 2 pages now. Arrows crossed between ownership transfers. Survey revisions connected to easements. Easements connected to infrastructure notes. The deeper I followed the trail, the more one thing became clear. The subdivision had not simply expanded over time. It had been built around a specific corridor from the very beginning. A corridor tied directly to the ranch property chain. Near midnight, I called Frank. He answered immediately. "You found something." It was not a question. "The same reference number keeps appearing." Silence filled the line for a second. "Read it to me." I did. Then another. Then the third. Frank let out a low whistle. "That is the backbone." I sat upright. Backbone of what? The original access structure. The words hung in the air. I looked across the table at the maps. Suddenly, several pieces shifted into place. Roads, utility routes, shoreline access, development staging. They all depended on the same corridor. Frank continued speaking. Developers sometimes build entire projects around one critical connection point. Remove that connection and the whole structure becomes difficult to justify. And this corridor points back here. Exactly. Sleep became impossible after that conversation. I remained at the table until nearly 2 in the morning. Every few minutes I discovered another connection. A survey note referenced the corridor. A utility plan referenced the same location. Even an environmental review mentioned it indirectly. Different documents. Different years. Same path. By sunrise, I had a stack of highlighted copies nearly 3 inches thick. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen. I stepped onto the porch carrying a mug and watched morning lights spread across the lake. Mist drifted above the water. Birds moved through the reeds near the shoreline. Everything looked calm. Yet the documents inside suggested the center of the dispute was no longer my dock or my pasture. It was the corridor itself. Around 10 o'clock, Melissa called again. Her voice sounded different this time. More cautious. "People are talking." I leaned against the porch. "Railing. About what?" "Questions are spreading through the neighborhood." She lowered her voice. "Some residents asked the board for supporting records." That caught my attention immediately. And they did not get clear answers. Wind rustled through the cottonwoods behind me. Another small crack had appeared. Not in the records. In the confidence surrounding them. Later that afternoon, I drove near the subdivision entrance. I stayed on public roads and observed from a distance. Residents gathered in small groups near the clubhouse. Conversations stopped and started. Several people carried copies of HOA notices. Others checked their phones while talking. Concern was beginning to replace certainty. Diane had wanted expansion. Instead, scrutiny was arriving. Then I noticed something else. A contractor truck that had been working near my shoreline earlier in the week was parked beside the clubhouse. 2 men stood beside it studying a large rolled map. Their expressions were serious. One pointed toward the direction of my ranch. The other shook his head. Whatever they were discussing, it did not look routine. I drove home before they noticed me. Back at the ranch, I reviewed the corridor documents one more time. A handwritten notation near the margin of an old easement suddenly stood out. I had read it twice before without understanding its significance. This time the meaning landed immediately. The corridor was never intended to stand alone. The corridor was never intended to stand alone. Those 7 words sat in the margin of the easement like they had been waiting decades for someone to notice them. I stared at the notation while morning sunlight moved across the kitchen table. The handwriting was faded. The meaning was not. If the corridor depended on something else, then every document treating it as an independent asset might be built on a false assumption. I copied the notation into my notebook and circled it twice. Then I called Frank. He arrived less than an hour later. The moment he read the margin note, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his chin. "That changes the conversation," he said. "How much?" I asked. Frank pointed toward the older survey, spread across the table. "More than most people would realize." Outside, a lawn tractor hummed somewhere across the pasture. Wind rattled the cottonwoods near the shoreline. The ordinary sounds felt strangely disconnected from the documents covering my table. We spent most of the morning comparing easements, survey amendments, and transfer records. One connection led to another, then another. The corridor kept pointing back toward the same ownership chain. Nothing else explained it. Around noon, my phone began vibrating repeatedly. Messages from Melissa appeared one after another. Residents were talking online. Questions were spreading through neighborhood groups. Some homeowners wanted to know why expansion plans were moving so quickly. Others wanted supporting records rel. The next morning began with a phone call from Frank before I had finished my first cup of coffee. His voice carried an energy I had not heard before. Not excitement. Confirmation. I found the planning summary, he said. I set the mug down immediately. And papers shuffled on his end of the line. The contingency problem was documented. I walked to the dining room table where maps and records still covered every available surface. Morning sunlight spilled through the windows and stretched across the paperwork. What kind of contingency? A brief pause followed. The development depended on maintaining a permanent connection to a parent tract. My eyes moved slowly toward the old survey tube resting near the corner of the table. Parent tract. That phrase appeared familiar. Very familiar. Frank continued. The summary references it multiple times. The lake outside looked calm. Inside the house, nothing felt calm anymore. An hour later, Frank arrived carrying a binder of copied records. We spread everything across the table again. The planning summary was buried among dozens of pages. Most of it discussed infrastructure sequencing, utility planning, and construction schedules. Then we found the section Frank mentioned. The wording was technical. The meaning was not. The original developers repeatedly described the community as dependent upon access and support rights connected to a larger property. The same larger property appeared throughout the ownership chain I had already traced. The ranch, or more precisely, the tract from which the ranch originated. A slow silence settled over the room. Even Frank stopped speaking for a moment. We both understood the significance. The subdivision had not simply been built beside the ranch. It had been planned around it. Around noon, another call arrived. This time it was Melissa. The background noise sounded louder than before. More voices. More movement. You are not going to believe what happened, she said. Try me. Several residents requested financial disclosures related to the expansion project. That got my attention immediately. What happened next? The meeting turned tense. She lowered her voice. Some investors were present. I looked at Frank. He looked back at me. That was a new development. Investors rarely appeared unless concerns had reached another level. Melissa continued. Questions are spreading beyond homeowners now. The conversation ended a few minutes later, but the implication remained. The issue was expanding. First residents. Now investors. The pattern matched the escalation I had been watching for days. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to make additional copies of several records. While leaving the print shop, I noticed two people standing near a parked SUV studying property maps. One pointed toward the lake area. The other shook his head while reviewing notes. They looked professional. Not residents. Not contractors. Something larger was beginning to move behind the scenes. Back at the ranch, I spent hours organizing documents into categories. Surveys, easements, transfers, planning records, development correspondence. The structure became easier to follow. More importantly, it became easier to explain. That mattered. Evidence only helps if people can understand it. As evening approached, I reviewed the planning summary again. One paragraph near the end stood out. I had overlooked it earlier because it appeared routine. This time I read every word carefully. The paragraph discussed future risk scenarios. One scenario specifically addressed potential disputes involving the parent tract. I sat motionless for several seconds. The original developers had anticipated ownership questions from the beginning. They had discussed them openly. Decades ago, long before the HOA existed, long before Diane ever stood beside my shoreline. The sun dipped lower beyond the lake. Orange light reflected across the water. A flock of birds crossed the horizon. Everything outside remained peaceful. Inside, the evidence continued growing. Then my phone vibrated with a new message from Melissa. It contained a photograph taken during the HOA meeting. At the edge of a presentation board sat a map I recognized immediately. But something was missing from it. The next breakthrough did not come from a courthouse or a government office. It came from people who had finally grown tired of being afraid. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the volunteer fire hall on a cold Saturday morning as I spread copies of survey maps, maintenance records, and archived meeting minutes across 3 folding tables. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the low murmur of neighbors filled the room. For the first time since this nightmare had started, I was not standing alone. Martha Jenkins arrived first, carrying a cardboard box stuffed with documents she had saved for nearly 8 years. She placed it on the table with both hands and looked me straight in the eye. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said. One by one, more people followed. Retired contractors, veterans, small business owners, families who had quietly paid fines they never owed because fighting back seemed impossible. Every person carried a story. Every story sounded different. Yet they all pointed to the same pattern. Missing records, selective enforcement, threats disguised as policy, special treatment for friends of the board. The sound of pages turning mixed with the scrape of metal chairs across the concrete floor. By noon, the box of evidence had become an entire wall of evidence. What shocked me most was not how much wrongdoing we found. It was how many people had been documenting it for years without realizing someone else had the missing pieces. A retired accountant named Frank brought spreadsheets showing unexplained transfers from community improvement funds. A former city employee produced archived permit applications that contradicted statements made at multiple HOA meetings. Even better, a local surveyor named Daniel walked in carrying original plats and easement diagrams that had somehow disappeared from later records. The room grew quieter with every discovery. The picture was becoming impossible to ignore. The same names appeared repeatedly. The same decisions benefited the same people. The same rules somehow applied differently depending on who lived behind the property line. By mid-afternoon, Daniel rolled out a large survey map across the table. The paper crackled beneath his hands. He tapped a section near the center of the development and looked at me. "This is where everything starts," he said. The entire room leaned closer. According to the original filings, several infrastructure changes approved by the board should never have been authorized without county review. Yet somehow they moved forward anyway. That explained discrepancies we had been finding for weeks. It also connected several complaints that previously seemed unrelated. For the first time, the scattered pieces formed a complete picture. I felt the same sensation I used to get before solving a complicated engineering problem. The answer had been there all along. We simply had not been looking at it together. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, momentum was building. People who barely knew each other started exchanging phone numbers. Neighbors who had spent years avoiding conflict began volunteering to provide statements. Others offered photographs, emails, recordings, and archived newsletters. The atmosphere had changed completely. Fear was slowly being replaced by determination. That evening, I stood near the front of the room and looked at the growing stack of evidence. The smell of paper, coffee, and damp jackets filled the air. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was seeking revenge. They wanted accountability. They wanted transparency. Most of all, they wanted their community back. Before leaving, we created a plan. Every document would be digitized. Every witness statement would be organized. Every claim would be verified before being presented anywhere. No rumors. No exaggerations. Only facts. As the last volunteers folded chairs and switched off lights, I remained behind for a moment. The hall had become quiet again. Rain continued tapping against the roof. I looked at the boxes, binders, and maps covering the tables and realized something important. The board believed they were fighting one homeowner. They were wrong. They were now facing an entire community that had finally connected the dots. And together, we had just assembled the strongest alliance they never saw coming. The following week felt less like a neighborhood dispute and more like a military planning operation. Every evening after work, I sat at the long wooden table in my workshop with stacks of documents spread around me. The smell of machine oil, printer ink, and fresh coffee filled the air while rain drummed softly against the metal roof outside. The same workshop where I had spent years repairing equipment and solving engineering problems had become our command center. This time the project was not steel or concrete. It was truth. Daniel arrived first every night. His survey maps covered nearly every inch of the table. Frank brought updated financial spreadsheets that highlighted inconsistencies in bright yellow. Martha organized witness statements with a precision that would have impressed any attorney. What started as a loose collection of concerned neighbors had transformed into a disciplined team. Nobody wasted time. Nobody chased rumors. Every claim had to be supported by records, photographs, permits, or sworn statements. We knew the board would attack any weakness they found. That meant our case had to be stronger than theirs. The soft hum of scanners became a constant soundtrack. Page after page disappeared into digital archives. Old meeting minutes, property records, emails, budget reports, permits, Contracts. The evidence trail stretched back years. The deeper we dug, the clearer the pattern became. Decisions were repeatedly made without proper disclosure. Certain contractors received work again and again. Infrastructure. Projects appeared to bypass procedures that ordinary homeowners would never be allowed to ignore. One evening, Frank leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. The fluorescent light reflected off the spreadsheets spread before him. "This is not random," he said quietly. Nobody responded immediately because we all knew he was right. Random mistakes happen once or twice. Patterns repeat. We were staring at patterns. Meanwhile, our legal strategy began taking shape. A local attorney named Rebecca volunteered several hours each week after reviewing the evidence. The first time she walked into the workshop, carrying a leather briefcase and a stack of legal pads, I could tell she understood the seriousness of what we had uncovered. She spent nearly 3 hours reviewing documents in silence. Finally, she looked up and smiled. It was the first genuinely optimistic expression I had seen from a lawyer since this entire ordeal began. "You have something most people never get," she said. Documentation. Those single words changed everything. Until then, many of us still feared the board's influence, their connections, their resources, their reputation. Rebecca reminded us that facts do not care about influence. Facts simply exist. Our plan became straightforward. First, organize every document chronologically. Second, connect every financial record to supporting evidence. Third, verify every witness statement independently. Fourth, prepare formal complaints for the appropriate agencies and authorities. No shortcuts, no emotional arguments. Just facts arranged so clearly that anyone could follow them. The process was exhausting. Some nights I worked until after midnight. My eyes burned from staring at records. My coffee turned cold before I remembered to drink it. Yet every new piece of verified evidence strengthened our position. The momentum felt impossible to stop. Outside the workshop, word quietly spread throughout the neighborhood. More homeowners began contacting us. Some had photographs. Others had correspondence saved on old computers. A retired teacher delivered 3 binders filled with archived newsletters and meeting notices. Another resident provided recordings from board meetings dating back several years. Every day expanded the timeline. Every timeline entry revealed another connection. Then came the moment that changed our strategy entirely. Late on a Thursday evening, Daniel placed a document in front of me and tapped a specific section with his finger. The room fell silent. The air suddenly felt heavier. This was not another complaint. This was not another questionable decision. This document connected multiple infrastructure approvals directly to information that had been presented differently to homeowners. The discrepancy was significant. More importantly, it was documented. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sound was rain tapping against the workshop windows. Rebecca finally broke the silence. "This is what we've been building toward," she said. Looking around the room, I realized something had shifted. We were no longer reacting to their actions. We were preparing our own. The board still believed they controlled the narrative. They still believed homeowners were isolated and powerless. They had no idea that behind a quiet workshop filled with maps, coffee cups, and stacks of evidence, a carefully organized strategy was now ready to move forward. And once it did, there would be no way to put everything back in the dark. The showdown arrived on a Tuesday evening under a sky heavy with storm clouds. The air felt thick and humid as homeowners streamed into the community meeting hall. The smell of wet pavement drifted through the open entrance every time someone walked inside. Folding chairs filled quickly. Conversations stayed low and cautious at first, but I could feel tension building beneath every whispered exchange. For years, these meetings had followed the same pattern. The board spoke. Residents listened. Questions were redirected. Concerns disappeared into committees that never seemed to finish anything. This night felt different from the moment I stepped through the door carrying 3 binders and a laptop. Daniel walked beside me with rolled survey maps under one arm. Frank carried financial records. Rebecca followed close behind, calm and focused. Across the room, several board members sat behind a long table. Their expressions looked confident, comfortable. They still believed they controlled the room. The meeting began exactly as expected. Routine announcements, budget updates, community improvement reports. The familiar script rolled forward while residents sat quietly. Then public comments opened. The chairman glanced at the clock and offered the usual reminder about time limits. I stood. The scrape of my chair echoed louder than I expected. Dozens of heads turned toward me. For a moment, the room became completely silent. I carried the first binder to the front table and placed it down. The sound of it landing cut through the silence like a hammer. Then came the second binder. Then the third. Nobody spoke. I opened the first binder and began walking through the timeline. Dates, permits, financial records, survey maps, meeting minutes. Everything organized chronologically. Every statement supported by documentation. Every claim connected to evidence. The confidence on several faces began fading almost immediately. I could see it happening in real time. At first they smiled politely. Then they exchanged glances. Then they started turning pages faster. The room grew quieter with every document displayed on the projector screen. The soft hum of the projector became the loudest sound in the building. Daniel presented original property records that contradicted years of public claims. Frank explained financial discrepancies using records obtained directly from official filings. Rebecca carefully outlined procedural requirements that appeared to have been bypassed during multiple decisions. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody made accusations. Facts did all the work. Then the board attempted to regain control. One member interrupted repeatedly. Another questioned motives. A third insisted residents were being misled. The strategy might have worked years earlier. Not anymore. Every challenge was answered with another document. Every denial met another record. Every attempt to redirect attention only led deeper into the evidence. The atmosphere changed completely. Homeowners who had remained silent for years started standing up. One after another. Martha spoke first, then a retired teacher, then a veteran, then a local contractor. Each person shared experiences that matched the documented pattern. The board was no longer facing one homeowner. They were facing the community itself. I looked around the room and noticed something I will never forget. Fear was gone. The people who once avoided eye contact during meetings were now asking direct questions, demanding direct answers. The balance of power had shifted right in front of everyone. Then came the moment none of us expected. A resident near the back stood holding a folder none of us had previously seen. He explained that he had served on a committee years earlier and had retained copies of correspondence related to several disputed approvals. The room became silent again as he handed the documents to Rebecca. She reviewed them carefully. Her eyes narrowed. Then she looked up. The expression on her face told me everything before she spoke a single word. Those records directly supported the timeline we had spent weeks building. Independent confirmation. From an entirely separate source. The final missing piece. Several board members suddenly appeared far less comfortable than they had an hour earlier. Outside, thunder rolled across the distance. Rain began striking the windows. Inside, the narrative they had controlled for years was collapsing under the weight of its own records. As the meeting ended, residents were no longer discussing rumors or suspicions. They were discussing evidence, verified facts, documented actions, official records. Walking out into the cool night air, I listened to rain falling on the parking lot and watched neighbors gather beneath umbrellas, talking openly for the first time. The board had spent years believing nobody could challenge them. That illusion ended that night. But the real consequences were only beginning. The fallout started faster than anyone expected. By sunrise the morning after the meeting, copies of public records, financial summaries, and documented timelines were already circulating among homeowners. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with damp earth as neighbors gathered in driveways discussing information that had been hidden behind closed doors for years. For the first time, conversations were based on facts instead of rumors. The silence that had protected the system was gone. Within days, formal complaints were submitted through the proper channels. Rebecca coordinated every filing with meticulous attention to detail. Daniel provided certified survey records. Frank finalized financial analyses. Witness statements were organized and verified. Every document that left our hands was supported by evidence. Nobody wanted revenge. We wanted accountability. That distinction mattered. The board tried one final defense. Emails appeared claiming misunderstandings. Public statements blamed clerical errors. Certain members insisted procedures had simply become complicated over time. But every explanation collided with documented records. The facts remained exactly where they had always been. Printed, signed, archived, verifiable. A week later, a special community meeting was announced. Attendance broke every previous record. Cars filled parking lots and lined nearby streets. The smell of rain drifted through the evening air while residents packed every seat inside the hall. Nobody needed to be convinced anymore. People had already seen the evidence themselves. What happened next felt almost surreal. Several board members announced resignations before the meeting even reached the halfway point. Others declined to seek reappointment. Independent reviews were authorized. Financial audits moved forward. Long-ignored requests for transparency were suddenly approved. The same leadership that once projected complete confidence now appeared exhausted and uncertain. Their authority had not disappeared because someone attacked them. It disappeared because documentation exposed the truth. Outside afterward, neighbors stood beneath streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. Conversations sounded different now. Lighter. Relieved. The constant tension that had hung over the community for years seemed to be fading. Martha smiled more during that single evening than I had seen in the previous several months. Frank joked that spreadsheets had finally become exciting. Even Daniel, normally serious and reserved, looked satisfied. The greatest moment came several weeks later. New elections were held. Participation shattered previous records. Homeowners who had never attended meetings volunteered for committees. Financial reporting standards were strengthened. Infrastructure decisions required greater transparency. Archived records became accessible to residents. The community was not perfect. No neighborhood ever is. But people trusted the process again. One afternoon, I walked along a section of property that had become the center of so much conflict. The air smelled of fresh soil after a morning rain. Birds moved through nearby trees. The quiet felt different now, peaceful rather than uncertain. I stopped beside one of Daniel's survey markers and looked across the landscape. Months earlier, I had stood there angry, frustrated, and isolated. Back then, it felt like the entire system was designed to overwhelm anyone who questioned it. Now I understood something important. Systems only stay broken when people believe they are powerless. The truth is that most abuse of authority survives because nobody compares notes. Nobody shares records. Nobody connects the dots. Once that changes, everything changes. Later that evening, our group gathered one last time in the workshop that had served as headquarters throughout the fight. The smell of coffee filled the room. The maps were gone. Most of the binders had been archived. Empty chairs sat where stacks of evidence once covered every surface. We spent hours talking, laughing, and reflecting on how far things had come. Before leaving, Rebecca looked around the room and said something I will never forget. The evidence mattered, she said. But the reason it worked is because people stopped being afraid to stand together. As the others headed home, I switched off the workshop lights and listened to the familiar quiet settle around me. The battle had never really been about documents, surveys, or board meetings. It was about a community rediscovering its own voice. And in the end, that voice accomplished what no single person ever could. Justice arrived exactly the way it should have. Not through anger, not through revenge, through patience, facts, and people who finally refused to look the other way. 6 months later, I was standing in the exact same workshop where this entire journey had truly taken shape. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long golden lines across the wooden floor. The smell of fresh coffee still lingered in the air, but the stacks of binders, survey maps, and legal documents were gone. In their place sat ordinary things. A toolbox, a radio quietly playing classic country music, a half-finished maintenance project on the workbench. Life had returned to normal, and somehow that felt like the greatest victory of all. Outside, the neighborhood looked different. Not because new buildings had appeared or roads had changed, but because people had changed. Neighbors stopped and talked to each other again. Committee meetings were attended instead of ignored. Financial reports were reviewed instead of blindly approved. Transparency was no longer a slogan. It had become part of the culture. One Saturday morning, I walked through the community during a volunteer cleanup event. The air smelled of fresh mulch and cut grass. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks, while families planted flowers near the entrance sign. Several months earlier, many of these same people barely spoke to one another. Now they worked side by side. The transformation was impossible to miss. Martha was helping organize donations for a local scholarship fund. Frank had joined the Financial Oversight Committee and somehow managed to make budget meetings popular. Daniel volunteered his expertise whenever property questions came up, ensuring residents understood exactly what they were voting on. Even Rebecca occasionally attended meetings, though thankfully now as a neighbor rather than as legal support. The greatest lesson came from something much smaller than audits or elections. One evening, I noticed a young couple attending their first community meeting. They looked nervous, overwhelmed, unsure whether their concerns would be taken seriously. I recognized that feeling immediately because I had lived it myself. But instead of being dismissed, they were welcomed. Their questions were answered. Their concerns were documented. Their voices mattered. Watching that simple interaction told me everything I needed to know about how far the community had come. Later that fall, I found myself standing beside one of the survey markers Daniel had helped preserve. The same marker that had once represented frustration, conflict, and uncertainty now felt different. The cool breeze carried the scent of approaching rain. Leaves rustled through nearby trees. Everything was quiet. I thought about the long nights in the workshop, the endless documents, the meetings, the doubts, the moments when success seemed impossible. Looking back, the outcome had never depended on a single discovery or dramatic confrontation. It came from hundreds of small decisions made by ordinary people who refused to give up. That was the real story, not the board, not the conflict, not even the investigation. The real story was what happened when neighbors chose courage over comfort, when they decided participation mattered more than silence. Before heading home, I ran my hand across the weathered survey post one last time. The metal felt cool beneath my fingers. It reminded me of something my grandfather used to say whenever a difficult job seemed too large to finish. He would smile, adjust his work gloves, and say, "The truth does not need help surviving. It only needs someone willing to uncover it." Back then I thought it was simply old-fashioned wisdom. Now I understood exactly what he meant. The community had not been saved by power, money, or influence. It had been rebuilt through patience, documentation, integrity, and people willing to stand together. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, golden light fading across the neighborhood, I drove home with the windows down and the cool evening air filling the truck. The roads were quiet. The conflict was over. The future belonged to the people who lived there. And for the first time in a very long time, that future looked brighter than ever. Justice had arrived exactly as it should. Quietly, legally, patiently. And once it arrived, it stayed.